Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this briefing. We are honored here to be joined here by His Excellency Jean-Claude Brunet and the United Nations Under-Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, who will brief you about the third review conference on tackling the illicit trade of small arms and light weapons, which started here in New York yesterday and will continue until the 29th of June. Mr. Brunet is Ambassador-at-Large of France on transnational crimes, criminal threats, and the fight against the illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons. He previously held numerous positions within the French Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs, notably in the field of arms control, non-proliferation, and security issues. His experience includes working at the French Permanent Mission to the United Nations, including during the adoption of the Program of Action in 2001, and as head of the Department for Military Export Controls at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Paris. Having led the preparations for the conference through extensive consultations, Ambassador Brunet is designated president of the third review conference of the Program of Action. I also have the honor to present Ms. Nakamitsu, who I'm sure you know, assumed her position as Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs on May 1st, 2017. Prior to taking on this post, Ms. Nakamitsu served as Assistant Administrator of the Crisis Response Unit at the United Nations Development Program. Since 2014, Ms. Nakamitsu previously has also served as Director of the Asia, of the Asia and the Middle East Division of the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations between 2012 and 2014, and Director of the Department's Division of Policy, Evaluation, and Training from 2008 to 2012. I now give the floor to Ambassador Brunet and High Representative Nakamitsu, following which we will take a few questions. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Bonjour. Good morning, everyone. It's a very great honor and pleasure to be with you today and to be sharing this press conference together with Mrs. Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament, the United Nations Secretariat. And it's, as you know, we have started our third review conference of the Program of Action regarding the fight against the illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons. And this morning we'd like to talk to you about this very important conference and the common challenge that is actually at the core of this activity that we face regarding the impact of illicit trafficking of small arms. And precisely I would like to first, in my presentation, underline first what is at stake and what is this common challenge that we face throughout the world. Then to talk about the French presidency of this review conference and of the program of action, and then highlight some of the priorities that we will discuss during these 2 weeks of the conference, and what is also at stake in terms of action, because precisely as the title indicates, we are reviewing and working on the implementation of a program of action. First, regarding the common challenge, what makes these illicit weapons, this illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons, such an important issue? Indeed, it's a common security challenge throughout the world, because throughout the world you see today, and actually not less than 17 years before when we had the POA adopted in 2001, but this problem is really urgent also to continue to tackle and to mobilize international community to implement this program of action, because we see actually this challenge and this threat growing, because we see that these weapons, they are not making the news every day, but they are actually killing people every day around the world. We have every year 500,000 victims of small arms. 90% of victims of armed conflict are killed by small arms. And you have a real challenge today because of these illicit trafficking of small arms, this black market of small arms, if you wish, that is fueling, terrorist actions, organized crimes, destabilizing societies, fueling conflicts in conflict zones, but also impeding and the possibility of creating a peace dynamic after a peace mission, after a peace in the peace consolidation post-conflict situation. And so you have really a destabilizing effect of small arms also on the societies with organized crime, again, as I mentioned. And so it is a humanitarian security and development also dimension, because in destabilizing societies, it is impeding also an obstacle to its socio-economic development. So that's the challenge, and that's a common challenge, and that's why this program of action that was adopted in 2001, it's a political document. It is not a legally binding document, but it has a very important asset. It is that it is universally supported, and that it's in its wording quite ambitious. And what is the ambition is that all states, the whole UN membership, had decided in 2001, when we had felt that there were too many of these illicit weapons flowing particularly from post-conflict areas, where weapons then after a conflict can be disseminated by traffickers and in other places around the world and can be harming the population there. There was a common willingness, political willingness of all states to adhere to a political document where we would define common goals and common and good practices to follow by the member states. Each state has the core responsibility to put in place legislations, actions to control borders and to avoid diversion of small arms into the hands, especially of organized crime or terrorists' use. And this is this is why it's so important. We have the third review conference, because every 6 years, so we have a review conference, and France is very honored to have been accepted by the membership as its candidacy accepted to be the chairing this third review conference. And France, from the very beginning of this process, has been very supportive, has been active also specifically on developing marking and tracing aspects in the, how to follow the illicit weapons, to see to be able to prosecute illicit traffickers and to fight against these networks. You need marking and tracing, and that was, for example, one element that we particularly developed, which then came, supported in, and which then allowed for the 3 years after the program of action of the adoption of the ITI, which is the instrument for tracing and marking, which is also a document that we are reviewing now. And France has been willing to take on this responsibility, particularly because of the terrorist threat that hurted us and so terribly in 2015, with many illicit trafficked weapons, small arms that were used by terrorists in the attacks in January and in November 2015. And we thought it's particularly urgent also to mobilize again the international community to fight against the diversion of these weapons into the hands, particularly of terrorists. And we can see all around the world, in many regions of the world, that terrorists get really too easy access to these weapons, and that there needs to be better coordination of action. The Security Council has recognized the importance of actions in this regard in its resolution of August 2nd, 2017, Resolution 2370. And this is on this basis, for example, that we work now in these 2 weeks of the conference to gather best practices, gather the political will also of states to focus on certain priorities in the implementation of the POA, of this program of action, and really to sum up, some of the main priorities. I mentioned already looking into the fight against diversion. And that means prevention. Weapons can be stolen from stockpiles. So countries need to make sure that there is a physical security and a well-managed stockpile for their police or their army. And then that is prevention, but it's also fight and investigation and prosecution of networks. From law enforcement. And that means also exchange of information and data on the weapons that you find, and with the markings and registers, you can then fight also against the networks. So marking and tracing is an element I have mentioned. A fight also against illicit manufacturing of weapons, because we see in many parts of the world and also that despite this easy access to many weapons that are in the black market, there are still also, in addition, illicitly crafted firearms. So I think I have, of course, the regional dimension is very important. It's very important that we promote cooperation between countries in a given region to exchange information, particularly for the prosecution and the investigations, as I've mentioned, and in many other respects. And of course, we definitely will promote, and that will be part of our discussion, international cooperation, global, regional, and really at sub-regional levels, and also assistance, because many countries can establish legislation, but they also need advice often for that, but also the capacity building and different aspects of actions which are needed require often good cooperation. There are many actors in the cooperation, but we need to also have lessons learned and develop further our collective action. So we are very confident that there is, because of this common challenge that all countries around the world in many regions feel, that we could that we can achieve in 2 weeks now a good final document that would bring all then the implementation agencies, law enforcement, and all people from security, peace, arms control, and development aid actors to be more focused on this particular aspect of their actions. So I thank you very much, and I pass on the floor to the High Representative.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Brunet. It's a very important conference that we have started just yesterday. As the United Nations, this issue of small arms and conventional weapons is and has been a very important priority in disarmament agenda. And I would say that it has now clearly become a very important focus also in the context of the Secretary General's prevention agenda, as well as Ambassador Brunet already elaborated very articulately, important part of a development, sustainable development realization. It is, in fact, quite clear why we need to pursue this. As you already mentioned, Ambassador Brunet, most conflicts today are, in fact, fought with small arms and conventional weapons, light weapons, but also just the nature of the challenge and how we must, in fact, take a unique challenge in terms of approaching this. Is something that requires the entire membership of the United Nations and the UN systems to come together and work towards our objectives. It's not really the reason why I say it's a unique challenge is because it's not simply a question of addressing how to protect the government stockpiles of small arms. Just a bit of a statistics. Today, we believe there are some 900 million small arms in the world. 3/4, 75% are in civilian hands, and vast majority of that weapons are unlicensed. So what does that mean for us going forward and tackling this challenge? It would mean that we need to go beyond working with national security institutions. In many contexts, especially in peace-building contexts, it will mean that we need to actually look at alternative livelihoods for former combatants. It would also mean that we have to work with the local authorities, municipal governments, working with grassroots organizations, also very importantly engaging with the youth population, health workers, refugee camps, etc. Women's groups, it's clearly a very deep link with sexual violence, gender violence aspects. We need to engage with local businesses, and very importantly, we have to really invest in community violence reduction programs, the kinds of work that I worked for 2 years in UNDP, the kinds of work that development organizations are in fact doing at the local and community levels. So it is very important to now say that a traditional way or siloed approach or compartmentalized short-term interventions will not be sufficient in terms of really trying to tackle this question. We need to make sure that we have a very serious engagement if we were to really tackle the illicit arms and going deep down into the community and the youth and the local government levels as well. So we have been, as the UN system, we have been working to make sure that we deliver a little bit more or much more coherently in our work. And this was one of the reasons why the Secretary General put a very important focus on this part of the disarmament work. Many of you, I'm sure, will already know that the Secretary General launched his disarmament agenda on 24th of May in Geneva. One of the pillars of that disarmament agenda itself is a very comprehensive set of agenda, but one of the 3 pillars of his agenda is what he called disarmament that saves lives. By tackling this area of challenges, we believe that there will be a very direct and immediate impact in terms of really saving lives, the challenges that Ambassador Brunet at the outset already elaborated. So this goes into now 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It goes very much into the prevention agenda. And we very much hope that with the successful outcome of the 3rd review conference, and together with the implementation of the Secretary General's disarmament agenda on this part, we will be able to start delivering a concrete and direct impact in terms of really saving lives through disarmament efforts. I will stop here and I think we will be able to take a few questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brunet and Ms. Nakamitsu. We will take a few questions now, and if you could please start by presenting yourself and the agency that you're with, please.
On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you both for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. One of the key components of the program of action is the marking of weapons so they can be traced. Are there any statistics on how successful this program has been, how widespread it's become? And in terms of the final outcome document that you spoke about, what specifically is going to be in it? And when it comes closer to the time, could I put in a request probably from UNCA that somebody comes up and briefs us on what the outcome is going to be?
We'll take another question. Sure.
Hi, Matthias Ask from TV2 Norway. I know it's a little early in the conference, but I was wondering if you could talk a little about how, what kind of response have you gotten from the United States, which has a lot of weapons in circulation, and now we have an administration who, on one hand, has said they're willing to cooperate on what you talked about, going after terrorists and their access to weapons, but also has said they're very strongly against stronger gun laws, for example.
Okay. Yeah, if I may, I will start. No, thank you for these two questions, and to respond, Madam, to your first to your questions. I mean, for the marking, indeed, there is a development of this marking practice and legislation, and it's difficult to have a statistics that is, but what I can tell you is that in the preparations of this conference, I participated to many seminars and gathering of experts, region by region, and I was able in many regions of the world at this meeting of law enforcement experts to hear from them that a lot is being done by governments. Since the previous meetings, in terms of putting in place the proper legislation and getting the capability also to manage marking systems. I mean, of course, there is the technical aspect, but then there is also the record keeping. And of course, this is an ongoing, very difficult activity because that requires a lot of capacity and of knowledge and also financial means. But what I can tell you is also it's a specific objective of cooperation programs that involve in certain regions, especially coordination of donors, of expertise, but also involving the UN regional centers for peace and security, and also regional organizations or sub-regional organizations that are helping their members specifically to develop these marking and mechanisms, because it's also related. I mean, it's also to precisely also exchange of information between countries in the region. I can, for example, to mention one region, for example, CARICOM, with the UNLIRAC is doing in these areas, and also in the areas of ballistics, exchange of information between law enforcement. But it's very, very interesting also the developments in this regard. And one of our priority in terms of cooperation to support. And what I would like to use the opportunity also to highlight something I wanted to say is that when we say it's important to have take the lessons learned from coordination of assistance, it's particularly important to have best practices and also maybe new innovative ways to act, because it's in the development aid per se, in the core development aid, there is a habit of donor coordination quite much developed. But in this sector, it has not been very systematically done, and in connection with development, as the High Representative has said, this is why there is the need to bring together SDGs, the Agenda 2030, and our peace and security activity. And we have seen from the French presidency, we have initiated together with Germany a donor coordination group for the Western Balkans. And it's actually very interesting to see that this came really at the right moment, because everyone was expecting this to happen, but it didn't happen because you didn't have structures for that. So that all the donors would gather together and have a dialogue with each of the countries of the region, and an agency which is CISAC from UNDP and supported by the EU, that is having a good knowledge of the whole activities related to small arms, fight against illicit small arms, and to have this donor coordination. And that's very important to have, and I mentioned marking, ballistics and so on. Also, this is another example of, where maybe sub-region by sub-region, but of course also bilaterally with individual countries, countries, donors need to work very closely, and agencies or countries willing to provide expertise and assistance can help to develop those systems further. It's indeed very complicated and very cumbersome sometimes for governments to be able to achieve these goals. But that's precisely where the multilateral, in this political framework of the POA is so important, because it offers the opportunity for precisely joining forces and to be more effective and helping countries to be at the level required. Now on your second, of course, I will be definitely willing to brief at the end or so of our 2 weeks with great pleasure. We definitely will be willing to, and together with the High Representative, of course, we will be pleased. And now, Mr. To turn to your question, precisely as I mentioned, the POA, it's a political document, it's universal, and it needs to be supported by all states. And that's why since the beginning of the process, we were concentrating really on, as I mentioned, this global picture of the threat of the illicit trade of small arms and light weapons. So this diversion issue of weapons that come into the hands of terrorists, organized crime, and this transnational aspect, so that the POA does not address the way individual member states define in their legislation the questions like licensing, production, or possession by civilians of. So the gun laws are not part of the POA. It's not. So this is not a discussion that we will have in this conference.
Thank you, Kak Rever, and thank you, Ambassador and Madam Under Secretary General. I want to ask about that particular point about Majid Gilir, Rudaw Media Network. I wanted to ask about, other than illicit, your position is very clear about illicit trade, but when it's come to the link between violence and gun ownership, there's a big debate in this country. And on global level, is there such a debate? Is there any question that there is a link between gun ownership, whether illegal or legal, and violence? That's my first part of the question. And the second part is, are you anti-gun? Are you for the disarmament of civilians, whether it's legal or illegal in general? Thank you.
So we'll take the second question, and then we'll come to the answer.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for the briefing. I wanted to, I mean, in listening to this and before coming, I'm thinking of weapons transfers in connection with armed struggle. I'm thinking back to when France, I believe, airdropped weapons into the Nafusa Mountains in Libya during the struggle against Gaddafi. And still today, I mean, the armed groups in Syria have weapons, and it's unclear. I guess I wanted to know, both in both connections, both in terms of the conference and in terms of France, what is your understanding of where the weapons come from? Currently, Hodeidah is under assault by, some people say, mercenaries. Some people say it's the Yemeni army. Are these transfers, how can this really be addressed? Because it seems to be, these are not just one or two weapons. Clearly there are people that are arming, in some cases, armed opposition groups, let's say in Syria, happened in the past in Libya, Yemen. How can the conference address that? And how would you, I'm not sure, does the French government view it as having been an error, that transfer? Or was it a learning process? Was it a responsible transfer, and would that take place today?
Thank you. I will take the last question. I mean, it's we are not at the conference looking into individual situations we are looking as states, again, universal framework. All member states are present and supporting the POA. We are looking into the implementation of rules that, in terms of recommendation, again, it's a political document, it's not a legal. But we have, all countries have agreed on common recommendations on how to fight the illicit trade of small arms. And so to respond to your questions, we are not looking into individual situations, but we are looking into a global, review of how best to implement the rules that are in the POA. And in this regard, we look into what is needed to prevent diversion, and to see, and of course there is the issue of transfer, and then there are given commitments and that are to make sure that an exporter state knows what is the end user. But then, of course, you always have all the conflicts, any conflict situation. Brings with the post-conflict afterwards. As I said, from the very beginning, this whole challenge came because of huge amounts of weapons in a given war area and conflict area. The conflict is over, and you have huge quantities of weapons afterwards. That people that are living there use as a commodity. And to try and to be trafficked and to be then sold to networks that they are then selling these weapons to organized crime or terrorists elsewhere. And that's the challenge that we are looking into. And that's unfortunately the situation in so many regions of the world and post-conflict situation. But we need to define together what is the best. How to exchange experience on the best way to for states to perform their controls to avoid diversion. But that's also in cooperation between states, of course. Please.
Maybe just to complement, I don't think it's appropriate for any of us to say personally whether we are anti-gun or pro-guns. But one thing that I wanted to say is that, there is no one fixed solution for this whole issue related to the relationship between arms, weapons, and conflict and violence. I think we need to make sure that we look at the totality of various instruments. The POA is a very important instrument to, in fact, address the illicit, circulation, the diversion, transfer, etc. We should also look at the key instrument called ATT, Arms Trade Treaty, which I think have 97 or 8 states parties that have joined, that actually addresses the issue of arms trade on humanitarian grounds if there are, conflict situations, or if we believe that the end will be using such weapons for, violence purposes, then, there is a measure that the treaty actually has established. In difficult, tense situations, confidence building is a very important measure. The transparency in military expenditure is another instrument that the international community has established. So we need to utilize those various measures, instruments, and tools that we have collectively established. So there is no one single solution to this very complex, very difficult issue. But definitely POA is a very critical component of addressing these issues. And from that point of view, I think, the member states actually all coming together and then reviewing the implementation is a very positive thing.
Yeah, just a follow-up. I didn't mean to ask for a personal position about this at the United Nations. I asked, and also I wanted to. You talked about different solutions. Is one of them is licensing? How important it is? licensing in this case to prevent further violence as a result of gun ownership?
Clearly, I think it's one of the critical issues. I mean, we looked at those statistics. I said in the beginning the vast majority of guns that are in civilian possession are unlicensed. So, that's yet another dimension that we have to look at. One of the things that I also wanted to compliment Ambassador Brunet is there is this a process of national reporting in the context of a program of action. And I know that as of yesterday morning, there were 112 countries that have submitted national reportings. So they are taking their responsibility in terms of looking at all of those dimensions and reporting. And you talked about marking and tracings. Some of the countries in the context of a national reporting, in fact, included the challenges related to those aspects. And then more than half of the national reporting actually came with the request for international assistance in terms of addressing some of those issues. So there are many different dimensions, and if we put these things together, it will become a very powerful, very effective measure to counter violence and conflict and crime, I should say.
Thank you very much. We have time for one last question, if anyone has any questions. Seems like it's a no, so I want to thank Ambassador Brunet and High Representative Ms. Nakamitsu for their time, and also thank you for your presence. Thanks.